People often ask, why are miracles, in the dramatic sense, why are they more common in some other parts of the world than we experience them in the U.S.? Well, for one thing, there are more that happen in the U.S. than a lot of people realize, but we're just more embarrassed to talk about them in the U.S. So I have documentation for a lot of those here, and actually it's easier to get the medical documentation here than it is in some other places. But it is true that they often happen more in other parts of the world. And in answering that, some of my African friends have said, look, we need these things to survive, but God has given you medical technology. He's given you other means. These are God's gift. Don't complain. Infant mortality, maternal mortality are still way higher in underserved areas in Africa than they are in most of the U.S. So one answer to this is, God doesn't do miracles to entertain us. He does them where they're most needed. Jesus fed the 5,000. That was a miracle. Told his disciples to gather up the fragments that remain. They weren't going to need a miracle for their next meal. God works through natural means when those are available. Those are God's gift. Second, here in the West, we've been very much influenced by the legacy of David Hume, who had some arguments that, miracles don't happen, and a lot of intellectual elite have bought into those, whether they know it goes back to Hume or not. If you actually read his essay, it's really poorly argued, as many philosophers have pointed out since Hume. It's not one of his better essays. It's one philosopher who's not a Christian actually called it Hume's abject failure. But because of this prejudice against miracles, Hume and deism and so on, in the West, we often are less inclined to talk about them and therefore hear about them. And in the West also, we're often less apt to believe in them and to expect them. They tend to happen more often when people pray, even in desperation, and they tend to happen more often where people believe that they can happen. So that's also another factor. You do see faith often associated with miracles in the Gospels, although it's still God's initiative. It's because often they come to Jesus desperate, act in desperate faith because they've heard that he's been doing miracles. So, it builds on itself in terms of faith. And then sometimes he does things where there's no faith, like when he stills the storm, turns to his disciples, where is your faith? And there's another reason also. When the Bible speaks of gifts of healings, or it speaks in James chapter 5 about offering prayer for the sick and they'll get better, it doesn't specify it has to be dramatic. It can be through doctors. It can be gradual. It's still an answer to prayer. Sometimes it has to be dramatic just because the situation's dramatic, but it doesn't have to be dramatic. But in areas of groundbreaking evangelism, we're in similar situations to what we have in the Gospels and Acts, as the kingdom is breaking into new ground. And there we have what are called signs and wonders. Now, these are designed to get people's attention. The signs and the wonders don't convert people by themselves. They draw people's attention to the gospel that converts people. So, for example, in Acts chapter 14, you have God bearing witness to the message of his grace, doing signs and wonders through the hands of the apostles, in that case, Barnabas and Paul. God will often do things that get people's dramatic attention. Now, that doesn't guarantee their conversion. Acts 14, some people, it says, believed, and some people wanted to kill the apostles. Same as in John chapter 11, where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. It says, some believed, and some went their way to tell the authorities, you got to do something about this guy. So getting attention doesn't mean people automatically become converted, but it does mean it gets people's attention for the gospel. And God will often do that most lavishly in unevangelized areas. And that's another reason, I think, why we see it more often in some areas than in others. But, there are places in the U.S., even today, where there are many people who have never heard the gospel. Places where I think God would be more lavish in showing his grace in this way. I mean, there are entire immigrant communities in places, certain apartment complexes where you have a lot of people who've come from nations where nobody's allowed to go, nobody's allowed to talk openly about the gospel. And they're here, and we can share Christ with them. So I think we may need to see a bit more of that groundbreaking evangelism, even in communities here among us. And we need to be ready, in the context of sharing Christ with people, to pray for them and just see what God might do.